The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good evening, everyone. This is Jennifer Dixon, and hopefully you all are here for our air quality information session for United States Steel Great Lakes Works, and this is for a proposed consent order through our enforcement program. So I'm kind of just going a little slow right now. I want to give people a chance to come into the meeting because we still have some people joining us, and I want to make sure we get the most people we possibly can while we're getting going here. You may have not been on some of our public meetings recently, but I know that we're doing a virtual experience now, I guess, and typically for our GoToWebinars like this one tonight, we don't show our faces, but I thought, well, that's kind of weird. And so I thought, well, maybe you guys would at least want to see me so you can know who's been talking to you during these. So it might be kind of weird. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But so we're going to get started tonight, and we're going to talk a little bit about the whole project in and of itself. So this is kind of how the evening is going to go, and it won't be too long. We shouldn't be here over an hour, but we want to definitely stay to answer all of your questions, as that is the point of this meeting. So the first thing I want to do is tell you who I have with me tonight to answer some of your questions. And you're going to primarily be hearing from myself. So I'm Jennifer Dixon. I work on our environmental support division. And then I also have Erin Moran. She's with us from our enforcement section. She's going to be talking a lot about the draft administrative consent order and giving you some information and details about that. I have Erica Wolf with us. She works in our SIP unit, and she is going to be available to talk about non-attainment questions if you have those. I also have Katie Koester here. She is our inspector for the facility, so she'll be able to talk about kind of how we do inspections, why we do inspections, compliance issues, things like that. Keisha Williams is here from our toxics unit, and so she can answer questions about that. And then I also have Susan Kilmer with us from our monitoring unit, our air monitoring unit. So we have a lot of people here that can help answer questions for sure. So we're going to do a little presentation on the proposed consent order. That's going to kind of detail what came before, what's sort of happening now, and how you can be involved in this process. Then after that, we'll have a question and answer session. So that's going to be your opportunity to be able to ask questions of staff, get some answers to things that you might want to know, maybe more details about what Erin talks about, maybe some things outside of that that the other staff people can answer. I want to make sure that we go through ways that you can submit an official comment on this proposed consent order. We have a few different ways to do that, so I want to make sure that's very clear how that is going to be able to be done. We're going to be having an official hearing. That official hearing is going to be on June 24th. So what that is going to entail is that's going to be an informational session like this one to start with, and then after that we'll actually take comments on the record. So that should be something maybe put on your calendar if you're interested in participating in that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where you can find other information about this project. So related to that, I did include some of the information we're going to talk about today and some of the information for this proposed consent order in the handout section of your toolbar, your GoToWebinar toolbar. So if you haven't seen those or you're interested in a little bit more information, I have in there the proposed enforcement summary, and that's in 3 languages, in Spanish, in Arabic, and English. And then I also included the draft consent order with some of the other ancillary information. And that one is only in English, but that is also available in the handout section as well. And we will talk about who you can contact with further questions. I'll give you some of that information too. So one more thing to mention before I go on to the next slide is that we may have some people calling into the meeting tonight. And when you just call in to GoToWebinar, you can't see the screen. You're just kind of in listen only mode. So I want to make sure that some of the times when we're talking about how to contact people and how to interact with us, that I am speaking slowly in case anyone needs to write that information down or things like that. So I just wanted to make you aware of that before we get started. So just so you know, your lines are all going to be muted. If you have a question, you can submit that question and type it into your question box, and I'll show you a little bit more how to do that in a second. You can also raise your hand to ask a question if you would like to verbalize your question. If you're on the phone, you won't be able to do that, but if you're participating via the webinar, then we should be able to unmute you, or you'll unmute your own line and be able to ask that question verbally. Completely up to you. Either way is totally fine. We're going to record this webinar, and the webinar will be transcribed, and so we will post that once it's done. Okay, here's that information about how to ask a question. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see just an image of your toolbar with the question box in there. So you'll be able to type your question in that question box. I always get confused about this, and I think other people do too, about how to raise your hand to ask a question. So I wanted to make sure I visually showed you this. So if you have an arrow pointing up, that means your hand is actually down, and it's giving you the ability to raise your hand. If you have an arrow that's pointing down, it means your hand is already up. So last time I told everyone wrong, and if you were on last time, I'll apologize again. A lot of people raised their hand and they were like, no, wait, I don't want to speak. So if you see an up arrow, that means you can raise your hand. If you see a down arrow, that means your hand is already up. So another way to ask a question after this, or definitely to get some contact information, is you can always contact anybody who is on the panel. And like I said, I'll give you that information as we go through the evening. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Erin. Erin, if you want to just introduce yourself a little bit more, and then you can go ahead and do the presentation.
Thanks, Jen. Good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Moran. I am the lead enforcement specialist for the legal settlement with U.S. Steel. I'm one of multiple AQD staff involved in this case. I want to make sure, there we go, I'm forwarding the slides. So first, we're going to start with an overview of the Air Quality Division and the enforcement process. And after that, we'll talk about the proposed consent order. So we all know that pollution comes from many different things, such as big farms, fuel-burning vehicles, and various industrial sources. The overall mission of the Air Quality Division is to protect public health and the environment. The AQD, or Air Quality Division, has the authority to do this by regulating industrial sources. The AQD is separated into different functions. For example, air quality staff monitor levels of air pollutants, look at different toxics to make sure public health is protected, conduct inspections of regulated facilities, and we review applications and write permits for sources of air pollutants to ensure the operations comply with our rules and regulations. Oh, it went too fast, but enforcement falls under the realm of checking for compliance with rules and permits. In this slide, I'd like to give you a simple overview of the steps of the enforcement process. What we call escalated enforcement is a legal process by which a company is able to resolve violations with the state of Michigan. So this flow chart here on this slide shows the steps of the enforcement process. First, one of our district inspectors will select and then visit a company to make sure that this company is following the state and federal rules and regulations and the conditions of any permit that they might have. District inspector can also request and review a company's records. The inspector then evaluates their findings during the inspection or records review. If the inspector finds a violation notice is sent to the company to officially let them know that we have found the violations, and also to give the company a chance to resolve the violations. If the company is not able to resolve the violations in a timely manner, if there are multiple and/or ongoing violations, or if the violation is what is called a high priority violation, then the district might send, or in other words, escalate these violations to enforcement. So once the enforcement unit, and that is where I work, receives the escalated enforcement referral from the district office and district inspector, we then send an enforcement notice to the company. This enforcement notice lets the company know that the violations that this district staff cited in the violation notice that they had earlier received will need to be resolved through the legal enforcement process. And next, the enforcement staff and district staff meet with the company to discuss how the violations will be resolved through this legal process. In a case such as this with U.S. Steel, the legal agreement is called a consent order. Once the AQD staff and the company agree on the terms and conditions of consent order, the consent order is posted online for a public notice and comment period. So this is where we are now in the process. The AQD holds a public hearing if one is requested or if the case or company is more high profile. For this case with U.S. Steel, we're going to be holding a public hearing on June 24th, as Jen mentioned before. And at this public hearing, AQD takes official and on-the-record comments. So after that public hearing, or any public hearing, the AQD addresses all substantive comments that we receive from the public. If there is any demand from the public on an item that the AQD is able to change in the consent order, we at AQD have the ability to go back to the company and propose changes to the consent order. If no changes will or can be made, the company and AQD sign the consent order, and after that, the company is legally required to complete the requirements in the consent order. So next, I'd like to talk about what the goals of AQD's enforcement program are. First of all, enforcement ensures that the state and federal rules and regulations are met to hold violators accountable. If a company violates the rules and regulations that EGLE and AQD are authorized to enforce, then enforcement can be used as a tool to bring the company back into compliance. Second, enforcement serves to level the playing field. So this means that we're trying to ensure that similar businesses are doing similar compliance actions at their facilities and that they're also investing in environmental compliance. So any company should not be allowed to gain any economic advantage by not complying with the rules, so if they don't comply, with the rules, this may, for example, allow them to sell their product at a better price or avoid costs of environmental compliance, such as purchasing any air pollution control equipment that they would otherwise be required to have. Third, enforcement serves to create a deterrent effect to the regulated community. So any company that creates air emissions must follow the relevant rules and regulations. And then if they break these rules and regulations, any of EGLE's enforcement divisions can enforce legal action and fines. And kind of to wrap that all up, the previous points that I just discussed here in this slide, those all work together to compel compliance in the regulated community. Compliance with the rules and regulations is key in protecting public health and the environment. So I guess after this, when can enforcement happen? There are multiple different pathways that violations can end up being escalated to enforcement. Our district staff are very key in monitoring compliance throughout the state. Our district staff travel to companies and conduct inspections, and any violation observed during an inspection is documented. District staff also respond to complaints received by members of the community, and they can find and cite violations as the result of a complaint. District staff also review test plans and test results, monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements. And when they're looking at these, they're always checking for violations. So in this case with U.S. Steel, air quality staff, and Katie Koster is our inspector for U.S. Steel, she found violations as a result of reviewing test results and also by observing violations during inspections at the facility. Lastly, a company can end up in enforcement by failing to meet their permit requirements or by failing to meet deadlines to come into compliance. Now I want to go into some specific questions about the enforcement process. First, what is escalated enforcement? And what is the definition of that? Escalated enforcement is the legal process which we use to resolve the violations that were cited and then sent to be resolved through escalated enforcement. Also, what is a consent order? A consent order is a legally binding contract between the company and the state. It contains a compliance program to resolve alleged air quality violations and prevent future violations. It contains a monetary fine and contains stipulated fines for any future violations of that consent order. The consent order resolves all outstanding violations through the implementation of the compliance plan. Once a company achieves compliance with the compliance program that is written in the consent order, AQD considers the violations to have been resolved. And 90% of the violations that are escalated to enforcement do end up being resolved through a consent order. So now I'm going to take a little sidestep away from the current case for just one slide. You may be aware of existing enforcement actions with U.S. Steel, so I'm going to do a summary of these here. U.S. Steel is currently legally bound to 3 enforcement actions that do not include this proposed consent order that we're talking about tonight. These two include 2 consent orders from 2016, which are agreements between U.S. Steel and the state of Michigan, and they also have 1 consent decree from 2016 as well. A consent decree is different from the consent order as it is a joint settlement between U.S. Steel, EPA, and the states of Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. So first, I'd like to talk about consent order number 22-2016. This resolved violations of the pickle line. So the violations that are resolved within consent order 22-2016 occurred in 2015. Since that time and after that consent order was signed and effective, additional violations at the pickle line occurred, and we are incorporating those into this consent order. So because of these additional violations, consent order 22-2016 will be voided under the proposed consent order. So we're rolling the requirements of the 2016 consent order into this current proposed consent order. So under this, then U.S. Steel will do additional testing and corrective actions to ensure that the pickle line is operating properly. So if violations of the proposed consent order occur, and that is going to include the compliance plan from the previous consent order, U.S. Steel will be subject to stipulated fines from both its consent order and then also from the 2016 consent order for a longer period of time. The next consent order that they have is consent order number 1-2016. This resolved violations of a unit called the Argon Stir Station. There were no overlapping violations in this consent order, so consent order number 1-2016 will be effective until termination. And then lastly, the 2016 joint consent decree, which is multi-state and EPA action. This action addressed numerous violations at multiple U.S. Steel facilities. So it wasn't just the facility in River Rouge, it was also facilities in Illinois and Indiana. So for the Michigan portion of that consent decree, it required U.S. Steel to comply with visible emission requirements at a unit called the BOP shop, as well as implementing other corrective actions at the facility. So any visible emission violations that occur at the BOP shop are addressed under the terms of that consent decree. So if any of you are looking at the violation notices, you might notice that there is a violation on October 12th, 2018, and here there was a violation issued for a visible emission exceedances at the BOP shop. So, and U.S. Steel took corrective actions under the consent decree to address these exceedances. So those are being addressed there. So this decree remains in effect, and EGLE and EPA continue to monitor compliance and ensure that U.S. Steel is meeting the requirements of the consent decree. And with all of the consent orders that we issue, AQD continues to monitor compliance with all of these enforcement actions. So now I'm going to give a summary of the current proposed consent order. I'll go into more detail about the different points here in the coming presentation slides. So overall, this proposed consent order identifies the violations that AQD found at U.S. Steel. The proposed consent order contains a compliance program, which U.S. Steel will be legally required to follow. U.S. Steel will be required to pay a penalty of $79,227 within 30 days of when the proposed consent order becomes effective. U.S. Steel will also be required to complete a supplemental environmental project and spend $300,000 on this environmental project. The consent order will also include stipulated fines for any violations of this proposed consent order. So this map shows the locations of the different parts of U.S. Steel's facility in River Rouge. The top area that we have highlighted is Zug Island. This is the location of the blast furnaces and slag pits, which are items in this current consent order. The middle area is where the unit called the hot strip mill is located. And the bottom highlighted area is the location of the bop shop, the pickle line, and other steelmaking and finishing operations. So now I'll talk about U.S. Steel's violations that we will be resolving in the proposed consent order. 2 violations were from the piece of equipment called the number 5 pickle line, which I'll just refer to as the pickle line from now on. First violation was an exceedance of hydrochloric acid. The limits in U.S. Steel's permit for hydrochloric acid are 18 ppmv and 1.64 pounds per hour. And when U.S. Steel tested and the violations that we're citing, the hydrochloric acid emissions during this test were measured at 54 ppmv and 3.55 pounds per hour. So those exceeded the limits in the permit. Since this violation, U.S. Steel has retested this hydrochloric acid emission limit twice, once in September of 2018 and once in December of 2019. And the hydrochloric acid emission limit was passed in both of these tests. The other violations were all visible emissions exceedances from 2 blast furnaces and 1 of the associated slag pits. And AQD had sent out 4 violation notices to U.S. Steel for these visible emissions violations. So the proposed consent order will require U.S. Steel to follow a compliance program to prevent similar violations in the future. The pickle line was the source of the hydrochloric acid emission exceedances, and there were also violations for improperly operating the pickle line scrubber. To address these violations and to prevent future violations from happening, there's a few things that U.S. Steel will be required to do. First is that they must comply with their hydrochloric acid emission limits set out in the permit. They will also submit a plan to repeatedly test to show compliance with the hydrochloric acid emission limits. So they're submitting this test plan to AQD. AQD will review and approve this test plan. So when we're reviewing it, if we find that the plan is insufficient, AQD will request that U.S. Steel makes changes to the test plan before we will approve the plan. U.S. Steel must also ensure that they are properly operating their equipment to prevent excess hydrochloric acid emissions. For this, they will submit and implement an updated operation and maintenance plan. So again, AQD will review and approve this plan, and if we find that the plan is insufficient, we under the consent order, can request that U.S. Steel make changes before we can approve or can or will approve this plan. And I guess also important to implement a plan means that they must follow the plan as written and approved by AQD. So continuing with what U.S. Steel would be required to do under this proposed consent order. As I mentioned earlier, the visible emissions exceedances came from 2 blast furnaces and 1 of the associated slag pits. Under the proposed consent order, U.S. Steel must comply with the visible emission limits that were written in its permit. There are multiple steps that U.S. Steel will be required to take to prevent excess visible emissions. First, U.S. Steel will upgrade their slag pit spray system. This is part of the blast furnace system, and this will help to better control visible emissions. U.S. Steel will also submit and implement malfunction abatement plans for the equipment or parts of the equipment that were the source of the visible emissions violations. This will help to ensure that U.S. Steel is properly addressing any malfunctions that may happen and that may cause excess visible emissions. Again, AQD will review and approve these plans. If they're insufficient, we'll request that U.S. Steel makes changes before we approve these plans. In the consent order, we are also requiring that U.S. Steel do more frequent visible emissions readings for all of the equipment at the source of the visible emissions violations. U.S. Steel will also submit more frequent visible emissions reports to the AQD, and in these reports, we're requiring them to describe any corrective actions that they are taking for any visible emissions exceedances that occur. So now I'm going to discuss the idling provision that is included in the consent order. As you all may know, or you may have seen in the news, U.S. Steel is idling different parts of their plant, and this has affected different parts of this proposed consent order. First, I'd like to give the definition of idling. So idling means stopping or the cessation of production for a period of 30 days or more. In this consent order, there are provisions that kick into place if U.S. Steel idles either the pickle line or either of the blast furnaces that are subject to the proposed consent order. So on March 31st of this year, U.S. Steel did idle the iron and steel making parts of their facility. This includes both of the blast furnaces and the associated slag pit that are covered under this proposed consent order. So what happens now under the proposed consent order since U.S. Steel has idled these 2 blast furnaces? Upon the effective date of this proposed consent order, it's likely that the blast furnaces will still be idled, so the parts of the compliance plan relevant to the blast furnaces will be postponed, and I want to emphasize postponed, not they don't go away. The pickle line will likely still be operating, so U.S. Steel will have to comply with the relevant parts of the compliance plan for that process. But upon the restart of any of these processes that are idled, U.S. Steel must immediately resume following the compliance plan. Now I'll go into U.S. Steel's penalty that they are going to pay as a result of these violations. So overall, the U.S. Steel will pay $300,000 for the supplemental environmental project that I will describe in some later slides. They're also going to pay a penalty of $79,227 to the state of Michigan General Fund. So the AQD uses EPA's penalty policy to calculate the monetary penalties. We do this for every company and enforcement case that comes through us. And in any case, and such as this case, where there's a supplemental environmental project, Michigan's supplemental environmental project policy also plays a role in the penalty calculation. So the EPA's penalty policy lays out what the fine amount should be for each violation, and then those amounts are added up to reach the final initial penalty amount. This policy considers the actual or possible harm to the environment or public health and the importance to achieving the goals of the Clean Air Act and Michigan's air pollution control rules. To calculate the penalty, the policy evaluates the amount of pollutants that are emitted over the allowed permitted levels, the sensitivity of the environment, the toxicity of the pollutants, the length of the violations, and the size of the violator. In this case, AQD also considered the quality of the proposed supplemental environmental project. Once the appropriate factors were determined, an initial penalty amount is calculated from the penalty policy. That initial calculated penalty is offered to the company, and then we negotiate the final settlement with the company. Factors such as litigation risk and the company
Hey, Erin, we can't hear you right now, so I don't know if everybody can hear me or not. But I can't hear, and so I'm thinking that maybe everybody else can't hear either.
Yeah,
Jim, I just heard you. So okay.
Yeah, we can't hear. We can hear you, Jennifer. Can't hear Erin. So
Okay,
Erin,
good.
you might have to check your mic settings really quick, or check your internet connection.
We'll just take a little pause until she's getting herself back on, at least for this. Hopefully I don't have to take over her presentation, because I don't think I would do as good of a job of it, but I'm sure we can make that happen if we need to as well. So Erin, if you want to you might even have to go out and come back in again, and we can kind of wait for you too. So I apologize for that, technical difficulties when these kinds of things happen. One of the things we can talk about while we're waiting is the ways that you can submit a comment for the record. So that the comment period has been open for a little while. Like I said, it's going to stay open until July 13th. So you still have quite a while to be able to submit an official comment for this proposed consent order. We have, you can submit comments by mail, and I will give you that address in a little bit. You can also submit your comments right to Erin, and her email address is morane@Michigan.gov. So it's M as in Mary, O as in octopus, R as in red, A as in apple, N as in Nancy, E as in elephant, at Michigan, all spelled out, .gov as in government. And we also just recently started having the ability to submit a public comment by voicemail. So if you're interested in that, or you know someone who doesn't have a good internet connection, or they can't call into one of these meetings, but they still really want to make a comment, please feel free to pass that on. And that phone number is area code 517-284-0900. And like I said, we will definitely have that available on the slide in a little while. But I saw that Erin came back in. So Erin, if you want to try to unmute yourself again, we'll see if we can hear you. And she might have just been having some issues with her internet as well. So I see you're unmuted, but we still can't hear you talking right now. Okay, well, I'm not sure, Jim. I don't know if you can try to see if we can get her back on there. But Erin was going to be talking about the supplemental environmental project, which is what this slide is kind of showing right here. We wanted to make sure you guys had a perspective of where this facility
Can you hear me?
is, yes, we can hear you. Good. I thought I might have to take over the presentation. I don't want to have to do
Sorry.
that. No, that's okay.
I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Not sure what happened. Can we
It
go
happened.
back a slide?
Yeah, you can go. Let me make sure that you have, because I saw you came out and came back in again. So let me make sure that you can have access to the PowerPoint. You should now, so try it.
Okay.
All right, there you go, Erin. Thank you so much for
There
your
we
patience,
go. Okay.
everybody.
We're back. Apologies to everyone. All right, so I'll continue now. Hopefully no more glitches. But for the final topic of the night, I'm going to talk about the supplemental environmental project that U.S. Steel is going to complete as part of this consent order. So first, what is a supplemental environmental project? This is an environmental or public health project that a company volunteers to do as part of a consent order. The project must go above and beyond what is required by law and provide added benefits to the community or environment that has been affected by the violations. For this project, U.S. Steel has agreed to tear down the abandoned and deteriorating Veterans Memorial Ice Rink, also called Dan Riney Hall in River Rouge. The building will be demolished to the bare ground, and then the ground will be leveled and filled, and then grass seed will be planted here. The demolition includes properly removing and disposing of any asbestos, refrigerants, PCBs, and mercury, which will reduce public exposure to these harmful substances and then clean up the blighted property. So U.S. Steel is required to spend $300,000 on this project. And then when will it get started? Once this proposed consent order is effective, U.S. Steel has 45 days to get started on the project. And then within the SEP that is part of, or sorry, supplemental environmental project that is part of the consent order, the project should be completed within 400 days of the effective date of the proposed consent order. All right, so this is a map of the location of the supplemental environmental project, which is in River Rouge. On the left is a zoomed up map of the area. The small highlighted point here is the location of the project. You can see U.S. Steel to the right or to the east part of the map, and then Jefferson Avenue is the long road that is to the left or to the west of the area. On the right is the zoomed in map of the area. So the building to be demolished is in the highlighted square, and it is next to the Dan Riney baseball field. The surrounding streets around this project are Walnut Street to the north, Richter Street to the east, Genesee Street to the west, and East Great Lakes Street to the south. So that is my last talking point of the evening. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jen for the question and answer session.
All right. So you guys can go ahead and type any questions that you have in the question box. And remember, we can also unmute you so that you can try to raise your hand. So just as a reminder of how to ask those questions and to raise your hand, I want to show you this again. I almost was thinking that when Erin lost her mic, it was a good test to see if people could use a question box. So you guys all did great. So thank you for telling me you couldn't hear her. I appreciate that. Now I know that you know where the question box is. So that's perfect. If you want to speak a question out loud, remember you can always raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can do that. So if you see the up arrow, that means that your hand is down and you can raise your hand. And if you see the down arrow, that means your hand is already up and you can put it down. So once again, here are the people that we have with us tonight that are going to be able to help answer some of the questions that you might have. And as you guys get ready to type your questions in, there was a question that I had, Erin, so I'm going to start off the questioning, I guess, which is what I usually do, so I apologize. And this question is actually going to go to Katie, I think, for the most part. So we talked a lot about visual emissions, and I think that that is a term that we use a lot of times in air quality, but I don't know that it has like a normalized definition outside of air quality, so to speak. So I'm hoping that Katie can talk a little bit about what visible emissions are. Why would we be looking at them at U.S. Steel? Does U.S. Steel do their own testing of those? Is it a visual test that they do? And maybe talk a little bit about how our air quality staff are trained to do those visual emissions tests as well. So Katie, if you can just talk a little bit about visual emissions while people either raise their hand or start typing in some questions, I'd really appreciate that. And don't forget, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Got it. Okay, that question had a lot of parts, so I'll
yeah,
try to
I know,
answer
but I think you know where I'm going with it, right? It's just kind of one of
Yeah.
those terms that we use that's just not that well known.
Yes, well, when we use the term visible emissions, basically we're referring to smoke that is, coming out of various process equipment or dust. Now, visible emissions are regulated in the air quality regulations, and the way that they're regulated is by a term that we also use we use pretty synonymously with visible emissions, which is opacity. And that just means basically the amount of light that the smoke or the dust is blocking. I like to think of it as kind of like how thick the smoke is. The way that that's determined is there will be a limit. In the case of U.S. Steel, there are different opacity or visible emission limits based on the process, and it's given as a percentage. So, for example, at the blast furnace, the company has what's known as a 20% opacity limit on a 6-minute average, or a 20% visible emission limit. The way that that's determined is by using what's known as Method 9. This is an EPA established method where we are basically just using our eyes and assessing how much light the emission is blocking, how thick the smoke is, like I said, on a scale of 0 to 100. 100 being you basically can't see anything through the plume. That's going to be your worst case. Every 6 months, AQD staff, as well as industry staff that are bound to these visible emission limits, go to a Method 9 certification class, and we have to pass a test to show that we can accurately determine the percentage of opacity at certain levels between 0 and 100. So companies usually have, and U.S. Steel does in their permits, they have the limit, and then they'll have a requirement to have either themselves or someone who works for their company go out on a periodic basis, observe the equipment, take these Method 9 readings, and assess whether they're in compliance with the limit. Additionally, when AQD staff goes on site, we would also observe the process when it's operating and take our own readings and determine compliance with this opacity/visible emission limit. Other ways that we determine compliance is if we get complaints. The majority of complaints that we receive about U.S. Steel in the past have been from citizens observing smoke from various points of the process. So we can also go out ourselves and do surveillance and observe the equipment that the complaint was about and take readings that way, and we've documented violations under those circumstances as well.
Yep, that sounds good. I know it's just one of those things that I feel is a little nebulous when we talk about it, and even when we use the word opacity, sometimes it can be a little bit, just like, what are you even saying there? So we did have someone raise their hand. Emily Nguyen, you have raised your hand, so I'm hoping that you're going to be able to, we'll unmute you here, so hopefully you'll be able to speak, and you go ahead and ask your question.
Sorry, that was my mistake. I don't know why that happened. I didn't have to
No,
have a
that's
question.
okay.
Sorry.
No, that's great. Well, you know your mic works on GoToWebinar now, and you know how to raise your hand. So that's awesome. I appreciate that. We did have another question that came in on the chat box, and this question is related to idling. So Katie, this is going to go to you again. And before I ask the specific question, because I do think that's a good one, but I thought we might need to just lay a little bit more of the groundwork on the whole idling situation with US Steel. And if you can talk about, because we kind of talked a little bit about what is idling and some of that, but can you talk about what still is operating at the facility first? And then I'm going to get to the question that was asked regarding that idling.
Okay, as Erin described in her presentation, you know, it's a rather large facility. It's spread out over River Rouge and Ecorse. Generally, we describe the facility as basically the iron making side, steel making, and finishing operations. So iron making just takes place on Zug Island. The only thing that is still operating on Zug Island is a boiler house that is owned and operated by US Steel, and that boiler house is used to run the coke battery on Zug Island. That is not a US Steel operation. That is a DTE operation, Detroit Edison. The hot strip mill, which is where a steel slab is basically turned into a coil, is still operating. The latest I heard was the plan is to operate that through the end of 2020. Then the other operations in Ecorse further south are the steel making operations, which include the basic oxygen furnace and other associated processes. And I'm sorry, that's actually shut down. But what is still operating in that section is the number 5 pickle line and other steel finishing operations, such as the continuous annealing line, some other annealing furnaces. That's just where they're heating up the steel coils, and some warehousing operations, generally speaking.
Okay. Yep. And this question is related to that. So I wanted to make sure that people kind of had at least a somewhat of a visual. And if you're visualizing that map that we had up earlier that had, you know, Zug Island at the top and then the middle section and then the bottom, the steam making part, hopefully that put a little bit of it into perspective. The question was, will the idling have any effect on the SEP timeline? So Erin, if you can talk a little bit about that, anything that you know as far as, you said that the SEP has to be started within so many days, and is the idling going to affect any of that?
Yeah, the idling will not have any effect on the supplemental environmental project. So the parts of the compliance plan, you know, that are related to idling, that's completely separate. So this environmental project is going to be legally required under this consent order. So you know, they have to start complying with the timeline that is in one of the exhibits that is part of the consent order as soon as the consent order is signed and effective.
So keeping with that whole SEP theme, and another question related to that, can you talk a little bit about why was that specific SEP chosen? Were there other ones that, you know, they were looking at, or was that one that they had presented to start with? And or how did that whole process work? Why was that specific one chosen?
Yeah, so whenever any company that wants to do a supplemental environmental project within a consent order, it's at the company's discretion for which project they want to do. So AQD and EGLE are not allowed to direct this project in any way. So I think what US Steel did in this instance was they reached out to the River Rouge community. I believe they reached out to the mayor's office in River Rouge, and this was a project that I think the office had wanted to be completed for a long time, and maybe, I'm not sure if they didn't have funds or what the exact reasoning why, you know, this blighted building was still up, but US Steel then came to us with a proposal to, do this environmental project, which is demolishing this abandoned, deteriorating building, which, is a nuisance in the community, and it used to be an old ice skating rink, so there's worries about like refrigerants and PCBs, and especially the asbestos. So by doing this project, it's going to prevent those pollutants from, I guess, spreading in the community, or, to any person that might be around this area, or, going in and out of the building if that's what they choose to do.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of how those kind of worked, so I appreciate you shedding a little bit of light on that. I'm going to flip this over to Katie again. So Katie, we talked a lot about the different consent orders that are active right now for US Steel, and then of course they have this one as well. So I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about the inspection process, in that, how do you decide when you're going to go do an inspection for US Steel? How often do you do them? And I'm giving you a multi-part question again, so I apologize, but because these things kind of go together, I want to make sure that we address them. And then, not only like frequency and that, but will that change based on the fact that this proposed consent order, especially if it gets issued with changes or without changes, what that means for your inspection process?
No problem. Just to describe the inspection requirements in general, US Steel is what is known as a mega site. This is an EPA designation, and what that means is that at a minimum, we are required to perform an inspection twice a year. And then over a 3-year period, we are supposed to have inspected every single piece of equipment that is regulated under air quality. So we are actually in the 3rd year of that cycle. So in addition to performing those inspections, I'm also on site periodically throughout the year, because the company has a lot of stack testing that they have to perform. So we are on site whenever those events occur to observe them. And we also have an opportunity throughout the year to assess compliance, because the company is required to submit a lot of different record keeping. And so we review every one of those records and determine compliance based on the information in those records as well.
So a lot goes into that, for sure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you on that one. Go ahead.
This year, I still need to perform the 2 required inspections. And even though the company, as we've described, has idled some parts of the process, there is still plenty of other operations to inspect that I will be inspecting and determining compliance on.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that goes into the mega sites, and I know it takes you a while to go and look at everything, and in the meantime, you do always respond to complaints and things like that. If anybody is on the line that is interested in looking at some of those reports, reading violation notices or anything like that, there's a lot of that information that we do post online. We have a part of our website, if you search the air quality source information, you can find that. If you have any issues finding it, or you can't find US Steel or any other facility that you're looking for, just give me a call or email me and I will help you, because I know our website is challenging sometimes, and I would rather you not be frustrated with trying to find stuff that I can give you in 2 seconds. So definitely reach out to us if you are looking for information like that and you're having a problem finding it. But it is called the Air Quality Source Information page, and you can find permits, violation notices, a company's response to violation notices, more information about enforcement if there is any, and things like that. So I don't have any other questions coming in, but we do have a little bit of time. So while you think of any other questions you may have, I'm going to go ahead and just talk to you guys a little bit more about how to submit an official comment. I told you in the beginning that I would give you that information again. So we do have several ways to submit a comment. You don't have to come to the hearing on June 24th unless you want to. That hearing is going to be the same setup as this, so it'll be a GoToWebinar virtual meeting. So you can submit comments by mail to Erin, and the address is on the screen. That's our enforcement section. It's EGLE Air Quality Division, P.O. Box 30260, Lansing, Michigan 48909-7760. And again, I'm just reading that out in case we have anybody calling on the phone. If you need that, it's available on the web. If you know somebody who doesn't have the internet or isn't able to get that, we can always, just call and we can get that for you as well. So you can also email Erin. That's Moran, Michigan.gov. So it's M as in Mary, O as in octopus, R as in red, A as in apple, N as in Nancy, E as in elephant at Michigan.gov. And also by voicemail, you can leave comments as well. That's area code 517-284-0900. You can find other information on the enforcement public notice page. So things like the proposed enforcement summary, which I did share with you in the handout section, the enforcement summary report, the proposed consent order. So those were shared in the handout section as well. You can also find links to other information. You'll be able to access the registration for the virtual public hearing on June 24th. As a reminder, you don't have to register for that. You can just come in at 6 o'clock on June 24th. You can remain anonymous if you just want to listen to the hearing, but if you want to make a comment on the record, you will need to give your name when you get on for the meeting. And then these are just information on who you can contact, who is here tonight on our panel. If you have specific questions, you can definitely do that as well. And before I let you go, I mean, you can leave whenever you want, I guess. I'm not holding you, hopefully, but we do have a poll question. So I don't know if people are used to doing these, but because we haven't been doing a lot of public meetings right now that are obviously in person and we're doing these virtually, we just kind of wanted to see if this was helpful or not. And we also haven't had any enforcement meetings like this for a long time, virtual or otherwise. So what we wanted to know is if people could give us an idea of, do you feel like you got a little bit more information, even not necessarily even about US Steel in this proposed consent order, but about the enforcement process in general? And I appreciate you answering this. If you have any comments, constructive feedback on these type of meetings that we're doing or ways you feel like they could be better, I mean, there's no ideal solution. We understand that, at least not right now. But it is really important to us that you get the information out of these that you need, and so that you can make an informed decision and you can make a comment on the proposed either permits or enforcement cases if that's something that you feel strongly about. So I really appreciate you guys giving me that information here. It is really helpful just to kind of know where people stand with that. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. I want to thank you all for spending time with us this evening. This is a really important part of our public participation process, and I know our situation right now is definitely not ideal for everyone. So if you have people that you know that were not able to be on tonight when we send out the recording for the meeting, please feel free to pass that on. Please feel free to pass out our contact information so that people can get answers to the questions that they have. So that being said, again, I greatly, greatly appreciate you all participating tonight. I hope that you got something out of this, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.